In this video, I'm going to be talking to you about the three key components of a hockey athlete, what they are, what the key elements that make up those components are, and ultimately what you can do to improve yourself as an athlete and what you should really be focusing on at these different levels. Now, those three things are robustness, intensity, and repeatability. When we talk about robustness, we're talking about keeping the body injury free, making sure that not only is it prepared for the demands of hockey, but also you can tolerate high demands in tournaments, for example, and that the key injury areas are addressed. Intensity is about then taking it to the next level, about raising our max outputs so that we can actually express on the pitch those outputs to be able to perform for those really, really high intensity moments that matter. The final one then is repeatability, and that is being able to repeat those high intensity efforts without dropping off. So what do you focus on first and foremost? Well, in my mind, and what I think makes a lot of logical sense, is to have a hierarchical approach to this. What I mean is focus on the most important thing first. Once that's in place, you can then focus on the next most important thing. And the model that I use and have kind of generated over the last couple of years is called robustness, intensity, repeatability. It means that first and foremost, if the key robustness measures aren't in place, then there's no need to focus on other things because they are the limiting factors to begin with. Put it this way. If you're going to play in a tournament and you haven't got a good baseline of aerobic fitness to begin with, it doesn't really matter what your repeatability looks like in small isolated moments, because you just will not be able to sustain that over a long period of time. However, if you're going into that with a really good base of aerobic fitness, even if perhaps your upper limits or the max outputs aren't quite as effective as they could be just yet, you can at least tolerate the full game demands, last a full tournament, and be effective all of that time. So that's why I say to focus on robustness first and foremost, and then once that's in place, we can focus on the next thing. So some of those things that robustness includes, got range of motion, tissue capacity, and aerobic capacity. Those are kind of the three core components. Range of motion of key areas, the ankle, the hip, and the thoracic spine. These are the three kind of key areas that we need to make sure we've got good range of motion. Again, if those aren't in place, it's very, very likely that problems will come up if you haven't addressed them early on. If you're in a tournament, for example, you haven't addressed the fact that you've got really kind of locked up thoracic spine, you haven't done much sort of thoracic mobility work, the knock-on impact for technique, range of motion, being able to get into low shapes repeatedly, and also the effect on lower back pain might be fairly significant unless you address that early on. So it's really, really important we focus on that. Secondly, ankle mobility. You have to get into low shapes all the time. If you don't have good dorsiflexion range of motion at the ankle, usually that's going to have a knock-on effect upstream. So the knee joint probably is going to be under more loading and more stress because of that. Again, we don't want that, so we want to make sure we've got good range of motion at the ankle joint. And obviously the hip, because we're into those low shapes all the time, you haven't got good hip mobility. It's again going to be very, very difficult to hit those shapes and to be effective in low positions for a prolonged period of time. So that's why those are some really, really key areas from a range of motion perspective. Now, when it comes to tissue capacity, we mean the ability of a tissue to withstand repeated loading over a period of time. And the key areas of the body that we need to make sure are fully prepared for the demands of the game are the ankle, the hamstring, and the lower back and core, as well as things like the adductor and quadriceps, for example. But these are the real key ones are the calf, including the soleus, the hamstring muscle group, and making sure we've got good trunk capacity to withstand loading of the core, loading of the trunk, to withstand lower back stresses. So again, we want to make sure that capacity is in place. We can measure that through things like a calf raise test, hamstring bridge test, or an isometric hamstring hold, and also things like lateral trunk hold as well to assess our capacity of the trunk. Finally, then, from an aerobic capacity standpoint, it's important that we have got a really good baseline of aerobic fitness first and foremost. Again, there's lots of easy ways which we can measure this. We can use something like a 30-15 intermittent fitness test. We can use something like a 16 pitch length run, something like a 3-minute effort. Any way you like to make sure we've got a good baseline of aerobic fitness and we can measure that effectively over time is really, really key. And we can measure that again against known benchmarks, which is a really effective way to know where we're at with our aerobic fitness going into competition. So we're not going to be, struggling after the second or third game. We've already got that baseline in place. So that's really, really important. Now, the reason why I love something like a 16 pitch length run is its simplicity. You can do it anywhere, anytime, with no equipment, and you can get it done, know exactly where you stand from an aerobic standpoint, be able to measure that, be able to prescribe from that, and be able to retest it later on really, really easily. So that's one that I recommend for the majority of hockey players, simply because it is so easy to complete. Okay, the second piece then is the intensity. So once we've got those robustness measures in place, secondly, then we're going to focus on intensity. Now, intensity is the component where we're looking at increasing the max outputs of our body. So the key ones really here is our max speed, our ability to express high levels of speed, both from acceleration and max speed and max velocity. And then secondly, max strength, so the amount of force that we can produce through the body. Now, when it comes to speed, this comes down to really just exposure to high levels of sprinting on a consistent basis. The most effective way of getting good at anything is doing that thing, and that's no different when it comes to sprinting. We want to make sure we want to get good at sprinting, we're doing consistent exposures to high speed sprinting. Now, it's not to say that we never do this until we've achieved certain aerobic scores. We should be getting exposure to sprints every single week, but it just becomes a bigger priority now. We're trying to really focus in on getting really good exposure to top effort sprinting. We know from GPS that if you're running around with a stick on the pitch, there's just not really the exposure to 90, 95, 100% of our max speed because of the constraints, because of fatigue, because of the fact we're carrying a stick and all those kind of things on the pitch. So we need to make sure that we're getting that 90 to 100% exposure, which the game isn't going to give us. And we have to give our body that exposure outside of the game demands. Lastly, then, when it comes to strength, we're now trying to focus rather than on the capacity and volume side of things, we're now trying to look at the intensity and trying to give our bodies exposure to loads that we're not yet accustomed to. And this is typically now we're pushing on beyond 80% of our 1RM to try and boost that top number, to try and increase the maximum amount of force that we can produce in the body. Now, a good guideline for something like a back squat or a deadlift from a global general strength measure would be something like 1.5 to 1.7 times body weight of strength. And that is regardless of male or female athletes. Just making sure you can achieve that sort of baseline is really, really effective way of, again, preparing for the final stage, that repeatability stage. We've got those max outputs ticked off. And the final piece then when it comes to intensity is our elasticity. So now we're trying to incorporate things like plyometrics to try to not only develop high amounts of force, but actually be able to express high amounts of force in short time frames, which is where things like plyometrics come in. We're trying to transfer a general high amount of force output in a very general movement like a squat or a back squat or a deadlift, for example, into a much shorter time frame where we're trying to improve our rate of force development, by which how quickly we can get off the ground, produce lots of force into the ground and get back off the ground again, as opposed to just being able to produce lots of force slowly. And the final stage then is repeatability. This means once we've got our bodies in a position where it's robust, we've got good capacity, we've got good volumes through the body, we're prepared for the aerobic demands, we've now focused now on improving our max outputs, our max effort from a strength and speed perspective. Now it's about being able to repeat that effort over and over again on the pitch, which is what fundamentally hockey is all about. Now, why we don't want to focus on this first is because, again, for the reasons I've just explained, if you just go out and you're just trying to focus on sprinting over and over and over again, but you haven't looked at the range of motion, haven't looked at the capacity, you haven't looked at your aerobic foundation, you haven't looked at the peak amount of force that we can produce, then your body is not going to be prepared for the more intensive demands that repeat sprint work is going to put on your body. But it is the most specific. So you're probably moving along a continuum here from very, very general preparation around robustness, range of motion and capacity through to much more specific preparation around being able to perform repeat sprints in a short, quick turnaround. Now, this final component can be reflected both in the gym and on the pitch. So in the gym, we're looking at repeat power expression. Now we're trying to look at, can we now not only look at high amounts of force, but actually expressing that now in short time frames. So even more of a focus on plyometrics, even more of a focus on Olympic lifts, even more of a focus on loaded jumps, where we're not just trying to express high amounts of force, but we're trying to express power now, which has a time component to it. We're trying to express high amounts of force in a short amount of time. And that really makes it more and more specific to the kind of movement demands of tackling, shooting, sprinting, changing direction when you're on the pitch. Now, when it comes to the conditioning side, there's a few ways we can do this. First of all, it's beginning to reduce the recovery periods between those max effort sprints. So if we're doing things like a linear sprint and just trying to get good exposure to max effort with lots of recovery, well, now in the repeatability phase, we're looking at, can we increase the exposure to that, but also reduce the amount of recovery we're giving that athlete between those consecutive bouts so that they're more and more prepared for that short turnaround, a high amount of exposure. And typically the research is showing that Something like repeat sprintability is probably going to be under 30-second recovery, probably more like a 20-second recovery between sprints, and typically more than 3 in succession. So 3 high-intensity sprints within a 1-minute period, that's going to be more and more closer and closer to the demands of the game. So that as a system is where we can begin to focus our efforts. So if you know that from a robustness standpoint, actually range of motion, capacity, aerobic focus, that type of thing just isn't in place yet, then make sure that takes up the majority of your focus. And again, just to clarify, it doesn't have to be that you focus all your efforts on one and none on the others. It's more like an 80% focus, 10-10. And then as you shift the focus, it becomes 80% focus on the next block, 10-10, and then 80% on the final block, 10-10. So we never lose focus on any of the different areas, but it's got to be the main focus, the main priority. Really got to ask yourself the question, what's the one thing that if I ticked it off, everything else would kind of become irrelevant? There's a really good book called The One Thing, which I'd recommend reading, which helps you to really kind of laser focus on what the priority is at any one time. Think about our bodies have only got a finite capacity to adapt. If you're trying to adapt to 10 different things at once, that's very difficult. If you're trying to adapt to a singular focus or 2 or 3 things at a time, it's going to be a lot easier for your body to adapt to that because you're giving it the right signal. We're not trying to spread ourselves too thin. We're not trying to be too ambiguous with what we're looking to achieve. We know exactly what it is we're trying to achieve, and we're very focused with that. I hope that's been helpful. If you've got any questions, obviously pop them below, and please do give it a like and subscribe to the videos.